welcome again to Free Media. I'm Robby Soave.
And I'm Niall Stanage.
Well, RFK Jr. clapped back at Senator Ron Wyden during an appearance before the Senate Finance Committee on Thursday. RFK Jr. was grilled about his attitude on vaccines as well as changes he's making to the CDC. And he exploded at Wyden for not doing enough, in his view, to counter childhood diseases. Let's watch.
How many preventable child deaths are an acceptable sacrifice for enacting an agenda that I think is fundamentally cruel and defies common sense? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do I get a reply? Or, Senator, you've sat in that chair for how long? 20, 25 years, while the chronic disease in our children went up to 76%. And you said nothing. You never asked the question why it's happening. Why is this happening? Today, for the first time in 20 years, we learned that infant mortality has increased in our country. It's not because I came in here. It's because of what happened during the Biden administration that we're going to end.
So this was a very stormy hearing. A lot of angry words exchanged, a lot of very serious accusations leveled at Kennedy, and then him responding, as you saw there. I guess I'll kick it off to you first. Even some Republican senators are not thrilled with Kennedy entirely. They felt like he's backpedaling on a kind of promise not to fiddle with the vaccine stuff. I've always said that I am okay. We've discussed this before. The COVID vaccine stuff, I'm okay with, at least for otherwise healthy people, even though I don't really want to restrict anyone's access to it. If you need to talk to a doctor and you're otherwise healthy to get it, that is not, in my understanding, contrary to where the experts are on it. I certainly don't want to make the measles vaccine less accessible to people. And Kennedy said he's not going to do that, and he said that in op-eds. What do you make of all this?
So I am a skeptic of RFK Jr., generally speaking. I do allow for the fact that there are some of the things that he believes that I am much more sympathetic to, things about additives in food and all of that kind of stuff. The crunchy granola liberal side.
The stuff I don't like about him.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily mind that stuff. I'm far more skeptical of him on the vaccines, partly because of this debunked link that he still purports to be at least sympathetic to between vaccines and autism. And I really think there's no evidence or no compelling evidence of that. And I think the views that he puts forth are legitimately dangerous in that respect. I also think, and you can't, to be fair, completely blame him for this, but a lot of this stuff has fed into vaccine skepticism generally. So we now see the moves being made in Florida, for example, where they're purporting not to require vaccines for children at all. People who know a lot more about public health than I do believe that that could be disastrous, and you could have really serious outbreaks of diseases that are completely preventable. So that's where I come from at big picture. Here, in relation to the hearings, one of the things, and you alluded to it a moment ago, was that he did purportedly make a promise to Senator Bill Cassidy that he wasn't going to meddle with the panel of experts at the CDC regarding vaccines. He purportedly made that promise at the time of his own confirmation. Then he fired everyone from that panel and installed his own people in their place. That obviously gives me pause. Just to end on a slightly more sympathetic note to RFK, that point about infant mortality, it is true that infant mortality has ticked up in this country. That is a serious thing. That is worthy of investigation, obviously. My worry with him is that he always is always the fear that he has the conclusion and then tries to find the evidence to back it up, which is that it's something to do with vaccines. Yeah. But that's
on the vaccine front, again, I think it's very unfortunate that the backlash against the COVID vaccine about claims that were made about it by public health officials and advisors and even President Biden at one point, because those did not pan out, it has tarnished vaccines that do prevent you very, very strongly from catching the disease, like measles. That was a real marketing failure, I think, on behalf of the people. Maybe they just really wished it was going to be true that you were going to get the COVID vaccine and that was going to be the end of the pandemic because no one was going to contract it again. That has turned out to be a very bad campaign message because I think it has turned some people more, or emboldened people who say, see, these vaccines don't even work.
Yeah.
And that's been a shame.
Right.
Because, I don't want people to stop taking the measles vaccine. And I don't want people who are vulnerable in a compromised health position not to take the COVID vaccine either. I think if you're healthy, it doesn't really matter one way or the other. But there are many people who benefit from it, but that's not how they sold it.
Right. Well, I think that the blanket criticism of vaccines has very serious dangers to public health, and also just rewrites the historical narrative from decades ago in a very false way. If you read, and I'm sure you're already familiar with the search for a polio vaccine, that was this like incredibly heroic public-minded effort that ultimately achieved something that was of massive benefit to the society and put to rest a concern that afflicted basically the entire population in terms of the fear of acquiring polio. And so to see that, or the measles vaccine, thrown into this sort of bag of, well, I don't like what Dr. Fauci did, or I don't like what Rochelle Walensky did, or something like that, that seems terrible.
And the vaccine stuff is, for me, a little bit of a distraction from the bad stuff Fauci and Walensky did on all the other fronts that I think is more open to criticism, frankly. I was going back and re-reviewing articles I'd written for Reason about my disagreements with the CDC, and I was remembering all of the now highly suspect guidance that they gave around like whether children should be wearing masks in school based on studies that turned out to be a kind of junk science that were inconsistent with what, you want to talk about international standards. They were recommending masking for children at a level that the WHO never recommended, that European authorities never recommended. We were masking more aggressively, and we ended up having worse health outcomes than a lot of these countries. It wasn't for lack of trying masking, particularly in blue municipalities, and just the outsourcing of the pandemic-making decision to authorities who were really, really married to that. I think that would be more fertile ground to examine. And also the testing failure. I mean, my God, that's non-ideological. That we had a lower testing rate than like Vietnam because the CDC forbid a lot of the private tests that had been developed and said, no, we're just going to use our test. And the one they had like didn't work at first. There was something wrong with it. That is just a huge failure that I don't know has ever been properly accounted for.
Look, I do think that scientists, whatever their affiliation or official position, obviously their work should be scrutinized and should be open to challenge. Where I think I have some problems is when people get into criticisms of behavior during the pandemic and then use that to justify a much more expansive anti-vaccine kind of approach. I think that is just wrong. And I'm also, on almost sort of a philosophical level, the idea that that expiating the perceived sins of the past should be the driving force of the current policy. I'm just not really convinced of that. What the current policy should be driven by the requirements or imperatives of the present moment.
I appreciate that, but I think I disagree. I would very much like to restore the public faith of this institution. Now, not by delegitimizing vaccines that do good for people, but by not having some witch hunt where we raise our pitchforks and find Rochelle Walensky wherever she is, or even Dr. Fauci. Although with that, again, on the origin of COVID stuff, we've talked on Rising a lot. I've done a lot of research on his advocacy for gain-of-function research, which it's not just like some tangential, theoretical, conspiratorial idea that could have been the research that caused COVID. That is, I'm not willing to just let that one go. I think that should continue to be looked at, but maybe they can't look at it because he got a pardon, so. And even if it was auto-penned, it still counts, unfortunately. Niall, thanks so much for joining us this week. Really appreciate it. We'll have more free media for you next week. In the meantime, feel free to leave a comment, tell us how you feel about the show, and take care.